All right, thanks for the introduction.
That's great.
Really privileged to be here. Just to add on a little bit more for those of you not familiar with DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, part of the Department of Defense in the United States, stood up in 1958 in response to Sputnik, an event that created strategic surprise for the US. The mission of our agency is to prevent strategic surprise. And I would argue that these sorts of events, this sort of community, is an important part of that process. Whether you realize it or not, you are contributing to national security. That is the perspective that I come at these challenges from, so I want to be clear about that. Try one more time to go to the next slide. Could I get? Great. I'm also going to come at this from a little bit different perspective than the other speakers. What happens if a piece of media shows up to you and isn't credentialed? You see all the other speakers had the little credential logos. I am an uncredentialed speaker. Can you trust me? Or could you trust a piece of media that didn't come with content credentials? Is it hopeless? No, there are things that you can do. So let me tell you about some of the investments that DARPA has been making in this space. Back around 2015 or so, a program manager at DARPA, and that's one of the folks that designs these research programs, Dave Dorman, had the foresight to see that the ability to easily create and change media may cause problems around our ability to trust media. From my perspective, we owe Dave a real debt of thanks, particularly on the national security side, for that forethought. He created the Media Forensics Program. And the focus of that program was to establish techniques that could provide quantitative measures of integrity of media assets, particularly images and videos. And that was really sort of a transformational idea at that time. That program started in 2016, ran until 2020. I had the privilege of inheriting it in the summer of 2018 and ran it for a couple years. And then I started a follow-on program, the Semantic Forensics Program, again with the idea that the ability to use AI techniques was going to lead to much more compelling media, much more quickly, at large scales, and that may create issues from a national security standpoint. So the Semantic Forensics, or SemaFor program, wasn't just focused on image or video, text, image, video, audio, and particularly reasoning across those different modalities of content. And we've been focused on what I'll claim are really 4 key problems in this space: detection, attribution, characterization, and evidence. So detection. Was a piece of media manipulated, otherwise falsified? Was it AI generated? That's the key detection question. Attribution. Does media come from where it claims it came from? Or can you determine where a media asset comes from? Characterization. Was a piece of media generated for malicious purposes? That is a super difficult question to even pose correctly. We are still struggling with that on the SemaFor program. SemaFor started in 2020, will be ending next September. But again, I think that's, as we're moving towards a world with more AI-generated content, it's not maybe so much, was it AI-generated or not? What was the intent behind that media? And then evidence. It's not just a black box algorithm that's going to assess this media and provide you that integrity score. Why do I think that that is a low integrity piece of media, or why do I think that is a high integrity piece of media? The focus for our development has really been on providing evidence to analysts, so think about Intel community, Department of Defense analysts, but you also need to perhaps provide evidence to the public. Putting this in the context of provenance techniques, right? So we've heard multiple times, well, provenance isn't doing detection, but they can help with that for sure. There might be traces left behind from watermarking, for instance, that can help with a detection. Provenance goes directly after the attribution piece. Doesn't yet, I would say anything about characterization, although maybe there's ways to proactively capture intent early on and bundle that in. Also addresses the evidence piece, right? Here's the claim, here's the signature, here's the evidence for it. So if provenance is doing that, why do I need these sorts of techniques? Well, part of it is it's going to take a while for provenance techniques to become ubiquitous. And from an intel process, maybe a piece of data that we care about just doesn't come with that digital provenance. So from a national security standpoint, these sorts of approaches, I would argue, are critically important. And then a third reason, I care about sophisticated nation-state adversaries. It could be useful, in addition to the provenance techniques, to have other ways to verify the authenticity in parallel. You heard some of the subtleties in the Broadcom presentation. The office that I'm in at DARPA also does cyber. Nothing is unhackable. It is good to have multiple ways to authenticate media. Okay, let me give you some intuitions for how we can go about doing that authentication from a forensic standpoint. So, digital, physical, and semantic integrity. So digital integrity is really looking at low-level artifacts and signatures. Might be things like compression artifacts, frequency artifacts. I should have expanded PR and U on the slide. Photo response non-uniformity. So this is tied to the actual physical sensor that a camera uses, and it is not perfectly homogeneous. There are some telltale noise patterns that can be used to tie pieces of media back to particular devices. And the example that's used here, there's an algorithm that looks over a window of pixels, analyzes the noise pattern, and can automatically find that aircraft that's in the image and realize that it's been inserted because the noise is not consistent with the rest of the image. Okay, physical integrity, that's really looking at where the laws of physics violated. Right? So you could think about things like geometry in the scene. If I image a 3D scene with a 2D camera, it creates particular effects, or the lighting could be inconsistent with the geometry of the scene. This particular approach was developed, what's highlighted here is developed by University of Maryland. They can automatically find the faces, fit a 3D model, estimate the lighting direction, and see that the lighting is inconsistent on those two individuals. That's a frame from video that was actually a composite of two videos taken at different times of day. And the lighting on the faces shows that. And then semantic integrity, that's where we can compare to other pieces of information. So you can look at an image, and if it comes with that metadata, the GPS and timestamp, that provenance might provide you with a high degree of confidence. Can you verify that independently? Well, you could look up that location and time in a weather database that you trust, and you could see, is the weather consistent? That's another approach that was developed by University of Maryland to do that automatically. So these are complementary techniques to digital provenance. I think another thing that's really critical to think about here is who's the adversary? So this is a notional adversary threat landscape. So the horizontal axis, adversary skill. What sort of technical capabilities, what sort of talent pool does an adversary have? Vertical axis, adversary resources. How much money, compute, time do they have? Right? And so there's different degrees of adversaries and different levels of resources here. And then if you look at it, there's also different technical capabilities. So starting with those red stars, something like an unskilled individual versus a skilled individual, low resource groups, nation states, and there's differences within nation states and peer adversaries, right, who have essentially the same level of capabilities that we might have in the US, or perhaps they even exceed in some areas our technical capabilities. And then you can put approaches for creating or manipulating media on here. And in particular, if you look at this sort of over time, what you'll see is that there's really been a trend of lowering the bar necessary to create compelling media. So things like GANs and now transformers and diffusion really make it much easier to create very compelling media. You could previously have done that if you were a higher resource individual, you had green screens, you had high-end production capabilities, right? But the rise of generative AI techniques are really lowering the bar here. And we've already seen the use of generated media in multiple contexts. It showed up on one of the earlier slides. Obviously, folks have seen the Zelensky video here, which was probably the first use of deepfakes in the context of war. The fake historical events, those are diffusion-generated events. You look at Reddit threads and people are creating historical narratives that didn't happen and supporting media for them. And it is very easy to do that now. And to do that potentially at large scale, all just driven by a textual description of some narrative. I think one of the interesting things to realize here, also in the context of nation-state adversaries, they don't come at you via just one dimension. That Zelensky video was also associated with a cyber attack on a TV station in Ukraine that changed the news ticker on the bottom of the TV station. So it wasn't just that they created that one piece of media, they tried to change the context too, right? Those are the sorts of things that nation-state level adversaries or adversaries with significant levels of resources can do. Okay, so again, from a national security standpoint, I care about those sorts of high resource actors. What I'm illustrating here is one interesting experiment that we ran a couple years ago on SemaFor. So yes, I can use generative AI to create media. Turns out that in many cases we can actually detect that with pretty high degree of accuracy, and I'll show you some results here. But what about higher resource adversaries that could maybe create their own new generative AI technique? Because a lot of the defenses oftentimes rely on, I need samples from that generative AI approach because I want to use that to find other examples of it. So that was the experiment that we ran on SemaFor. Now, we didn't have direct access to one of those groups, but we had a really strong proxy. And that strong proxy was NVIDIA. We had a great collaboration with NVIDIA on SemaFor. In fact, they are a research organization that we are paying to work on the SemaFor program. When they were working on StyleGAN3, the experiment that we ran was, could we create detectors for StyleGAN3, not knowing about its architecture, not having samples from the training data? And the result that really surprised me is in the upper right-hand corner. That's a receiver operating characteristic curve for those of you who know those curves. But basically what it is a plot of my ability to correctly detect whether something was AI generated versus false alarm rate. I want to be in that upper left-hand corner. And one way to assess the quality of the result is I can look at what's the area underneath that curve. That area goes up as I go up to the upper left-hand corner. This is a result unlike what I typically see in the computer vision community. This is a super strong detection result. So the area under the curve normalized to be 1. These results are 0.999 something. This is not a typical result. I don't want to tell you that this is the level of performance that we have across the board for detection. It's not. But in some cases we do, and this was a very exciting and interesting experiment. The other piece of the excitement here for me was the fact that NVIDIA actually withheld StyleGAN3. They delayed it until the detectors that were developed on the SemaFor program were ready. NVIDIA literally went back to their commercial customer and said, we're going to be late on the release of StyleGAN3, and here's why. And when they released it, they put the detectors out. So we open sourced the detectors that we developed on the SemaFor program. NVIDIA advertised them in parallel with StyleGAN3. You can still go to the software repository and get those detectors. This is a great example of the sorts of collaboration that we need across the community. What I was hoping with this experiment was that we would drive some change in the generative AI community. In the cyber community, folks that find vulnerabilities, there's a responsible disclosure process. They might create a defense, or they might tell people ahead of time and wait. And I was hoping to help create that in the generative AI community. That hasn't happened yet. But this is still a really great example of the ability to collaborate between industry, academia, and government, because there were pieces of all of that involved here. And then I'm going to show you one more result, which I think is one of the most compelling things that we've done on the programs. And you can thank Hani and Shruti Agarwal, who's here, for some of the foundational work that went into this. So these are person of interest defensive models. So for high-profile individuals where known good training data is available, you can learn a person-specific model of how they behave. Specifically, how do they move their head? How do parts of their face move, like the corner of their lips, the corner of their eyes, their eyebrows? How does all of that move together? Used to be it took about 10 hours worth of training data. We're down to about an hour's worth of training data to do that, known good data. And we can use that to differentiate a deep fake from the real individual, an impersonator plus a deep fake from the real individual. Just think about what you would have to do as an impersonator to get that right. You would have to know, well, when that individual moves their head like this, I have to move this part of my face this way, this part of my face another way. Very difficult to do from an impersonator standpoint. It also would require some advances on the generative AI techniques. I'm not saying that any defense, is permanent, but this is a really interesting and compelling defense. This is in that category of semantic defenses where we have learned, with respect to known good data, what are those motion patterns, and we can use that to differentiate. And so we're showing an automatic detection result on the right-hand side. We've further gone on, and I don't have the results here, to be able to automatically identify what are the inconsistencies in the video between the underlying individual and surface that to a human. So that's in that evidence category. Let me provide you some evidence. And that could be really useful actually from a narrative standpoint too. If you had to take a result like this and go out to the public, you might be able to provide evidence that people could sort of go visually verify themselves. So this, again, is one of the really compelling capabilities developed on the programs. So I'm going to just wrap up here with a few key points. I think open source software and standards is really an enabler for the community here, right? There are risks around open sourcing generative AI, so I think it's appropriate to have a conversation. But we have used it to help build a community and to get capabilities out to the broader community. SemaFor is planning some additional open source releases. That could be enablers for those of you looking to add on to content authenticity approaches, or those of you looking to start companies or already have companies in this space. I think, just touching on the bottom bullet, there is really an opportunity here to jumpstart commercial industry, and we need that. US government can't be the funder forever of these sorts of capabilities. I think long term, we want to get to a model where we can benefit from commercial industry in this space and purchase commercial capabilities. And I think there is a lot of attack surface out there, given that we don't have broad-based adoption of provenance techniques yet, where these sorts of approaches could really help. One of the things that I would advocate for, going back to that threat landscape, is really to have the community take a look at that. So you heard a little bit about it in the Broadcom presentation, different circles of trust, right? That also corresponds to things like different levels of adversary skills and resources. Who are we building media defenses to be robust against? In what situations? Because from where I sit, there is no perfect solution. So we really need hybrid approaches. We need layered defenses. And again, I think you heard that echoed in multiple contexts. The establishment of norms, also folks touched on that today. You see that in the AI executive order that came out recently. That will drive the adoption of digital provenance techniques within the US government. I think we're probably likely to be an early adopter and set the standard there. That's a good thing from a community perspective. But again, I think we're going to need these layered defenses. We're going to need complementary approaches because there really isn't a silver bullet here. And the level of defense that you need sometimes depends on the adversary and the context. And then just a shout out, on the right-hand side was just a screen grab from one of the reports from the Computational Disinformation Symposiums that the NYU team has been running on SemaFor. We actually had a dedicated team looking at the threat landscape, producing publicly available reports on our understanding of threats. I would love to see that sort of work continue across the community after SemaFor ends next September. So just a shout out for that. Thanks for the time and attention. Again, very important community. Happy that we can be a part of it and look forward to further discussions today. Thanks.